Texas time, where sentences feel longer. The meaning of Texas time. In Texas prisons, there's a phrase inmates repeat quietly to each other. Not written in any law. Not printed in any rulebook. But it shapes how thousands of people experience their sentence. They call it Texas time. The idea is simple, but unsettling. In Texas, a sentence often feels longer than the number written in court documents. Sometimes it's because of strict parole policies. Sometimes it's because of the size and structure of the prison system itself. And sometimes, it's because the path out of prison is far more complicated than many people expect. Today, Texas operates one of the largest prison systems in the United States. More than 100 state prisons and facilities hold tens of thousands of inmates. But to understand why prisoners talk about Texas time, we have to go back. Back to how Texas built one of the most powerful correctional systems in the country. And why its approach to punishment became known nationwide for being especially tough. This story begins long before modern supermax units, electronic monitoring, or parole boards. It begins in the 19th century, when Texas prisons were built on a system that would shape incarceration for generations.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
Birth of the Texas prison system. The foundations of Texas incarceration were laid shortly after the state joined the United States in 1845. Within a few years, Texas opened its first state prison in Huntsville, a town about 70 miles north of Houston. The facility became known as the Huntsville Unit, and it remains one of the most important prisons in Texas to this day. In the late 1800s, Texas developed a prison system unlike many others. Instead of building large urban prisons, the state created prison farms. Inmates worked vast agricultural fields owned by the state. Cotton, corn, sugar cane. The labor was demanding and often done under armed supervision. Historians say the system closely resembled forced agricultural labor that had existed in the American South before the Civil War. Former prisoners and historians later described harsh working conditions during this era. Punishments for disobedience could include physical discipline and solitary confinement. By the early 20th century, Texas had built a network of prison farms across the state. These facilities became the backbone of the correctional system. But the structure of Texas incarceration would face major legal challenges decades later. Challenges that would eventually transform the system and reshape the meaning of punishment inside Texas prisons. The legal turning point. For most of the 20th century, courts rarely interfered with prison management. The prevailing belief was simple. Once a person was sentenced, prison officials had nearly complete control. But that began to change in 1972. A Texas inmate named David Ruiz filed a lawsuit against the state. The case would become known as Ruiz versus Estelle. Ruiz argued that conditions inside Texas prisons violated the U.S. Constitution's Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. At first, the case received little attention. But over the next several years, testimony from inmates, guards, and experts painted a disturbing picture of prison life. The trial revealed allegations of violence, overcrowding, and a controversial system where certain inmates were given authority over others. These inmate enforcers were known as building tenders. According to testimony, building tenders sometimes used violence to maintain order. In 1980, a federal judge ruled that major parts of the Texas prison system were unconstitutional. The ruling forced Texas to implement sweeping reforms. And it marked one of the most significant prison reform decisions in U.S. history. But reform did not make the Texas system smaller. In fact, in the decades that followed, it would become even larger. The explosion of the prison population. The 1980s and 1990s were a turning point in American criminal justice. Across the United States, lawmakers passed tougher sentencing laws. Texas was no exception. During this period, the state expanded its prison capacity dramatically. New prisons were built across rural counties. Many local communities welcomed them. Prisons brought jobs and economic activity. Between the late 1980s and early 2000s, Texas prison capacity increased several times over. By the early 2000s, Texas operated one of the largest prison systems in the world, not just the United States. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice, known as TDCJ, eventually managed state prisons, estate jails, transfer facilities, medical units, and specialized high-security units. By the mid-2000s, the system held over 150,000 inmates. But numbers alone don't explain the phrase, Texas time. Because the feeling of time inside Texas prisons is shaped by something else. Something that affects nearly every inmate. Parole. Understanding parole in Texas. In Texas, most inmates are not guaranteed to serve the full sentence imposed by the court. But that does not mean early release is automatic. Instead, the decision often depends on the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. Parole eligibility depends on several factors. These include the type of crime, the date of the offense, a sentencing laws in effect at the time, and the inmate's behavior while incarcerated. In many cases, inmates become eligible for parole after serving a portion of their sentence. But eligibility does not mean approval. The board reviews files, criminal history, and other documentation. In many cases, there is no in-person hearing. Instead, board members vote after reviewing written records. If parole is denied, inmates may have to wait years before the next review. For prisoners hoping to return home, these waiting periods can stretch time in unexpected ways. This uncertainty is one reason inmates often describe their sentences as feeling longer than expected. And it helps explain why the phrase, Texas time, continues to circulate inside prison walls. The geography of Texas prisons. Another factor shaping the experience of time in Texas prisons is geography. Many prisons are located in remote rural areas. Some facilities sit miles away from major cities. For families trying to visit inmates, the travel can be difficult. Long drives, limited public transportation, and sometimes expensive overnight stays. Researchers studying prison systems have noted that distance can affect inmate morale and family contact. Studies show that inmates who maintain regular family connections often have better post-release outcomes. But for many Texas prisoners, visits can be rare. The size of the state itself plays a role. Texas covers more than 260,000 square miles, making it the second largest state in the United States. That scale means prisons are spread across a vast landscape. For inmates waiting years for release, the distance between prison and home can make time feel even slower. The phrase, Texas time. Inside prison culture, language evolves. Certain phrases capture experiences that official reports never fully describe. Texas time is one of those phrases. Former inmates interviewed by journalists have used it to describe several things: long parole waits, strict sentencing laws, and the psychological weight of uncertainty about release. But the phrase is not a legal term. It does not appear in statutes or court rulings. Instead, it exists in conversations between inmates. A shorthand expression for the feeling that time inside the Texas system moves differently. Some former prisoners say it reflects how slowly days pass in confinement. Others say it refers to how difficult it can be to predict when someone will actually leave prison. The phrase carries meaning, but its definition can vary depending on who uses it. What is clear, however, is that Texas prisons operate under a system shaped by decades of legal battles, political decisions, and social change. And those decisions have had real consequences for the people living behind the walls. What comes next? Understanding Texas time requires looking deeper. Beyond prison farms. Beyond population statistics. Beyond parole policies. Because the modern Texas prison system contains some of the most restrictive units in the United States. Facilities where inmates spend 23 hours a day in isolation. Units designed for prisoners considered the most dangerous. And disciplinary systems that critics and officials continue to debate today. Inside the most restrictive units. Entering administrative segregation. For some prisoners in Texas, time is not just long. It is almost motionless. Inside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, certain inmates are placed in what is called administrative segregation, often shortened to ADSEG. This is Texas's version of long-term solitary confinement. In these units, inmates typically spend around 23 hours a day inside a single cell. Contact with other prisoners is extremely limited. Meals arrive through a slot in the steel door. Exercise, when permitted, often takes place alone in small enclosed areas sometimes referred to as recreation cages. Administrative segregation is generally used for inmates who prison officials believe pose serious security risks. This can include prisoners accused of gang leadership, repeated violent behavior, or attacks on staff. But critics argue that the system can keep inmates isolated for many years, sometimes with limited opportunities for release back into the general population. And for prisoners living under these conditions, the passage of time can feel very different. The Polunsky Unit. One of the most well-known high-security facilities in Texas is the Allan B. Polunsky Unit. Located near the town of Livingston, the Polunsky Unit opened in 1993. The prison is designed to house inmates classified as maximum security risks. It is also the primary facility that houses male prisoners on Texas death row. Inside the Polunsky Unit, security procedures are extremely strict. Cells are built with reinforced doors and surveillance systems. Movement through the facility is tightly controlled. Inmates are typically escorted in restraints when they leave their cells. For prisoners assigned to death row, daily life is highly structured and limited. They usually spend most of the day inside their cells. Recreation is conducted alone, and visits from family members take place through secure glass partitions. Supporters of the system argue that these strict measures are necessary to maintain safety in a facility holding prisoners convicted of the most serious crimes. But critics have raised concerns about the psychological impact of prolonged isolation. Life in a solitary cell. A typical administrative segregation cell in Texas measures roughly 60 to 80 square feet. Inside, the furnishings are minimal. A concrete bed attached to the wall, a thin mattress, a stainless steel toilet and sink, and sometimes a small writing surface. Inmates usually eat their meals alone. Human contact is limited to brief interactions with correctional officers. For some prisoners, days are structured around routines: reading, writing letters, watching television, if permitted. But for others, the long hours of isolation can become mentally exhausting. Researchers studying solitary confinement have found that prolonged isolation may contribute to psychological stress in some inmates. Symptoms reported in academic studies include anxiety, depression, and difficulty concentrating. However, correctional agencies often argue that segregation is necessary to manage violent individuals and maintain overall prison safety. The debate continues today. Why prisoners are placed in segregation? Placement in administrative segregation usually follows a classification review. Texas prison officials evaluate several factors before assigning an inmate to these units. These may include confirmed gang leadership, repeated assaults on other inmates, attacks on correctional staff, possession of dangerous contraband, or credible threats to institutional security. In many cases, inmates are assigned to segregation because of gang-related activity. Prison gangs have historically played a major role in Texas prison security concerns. Some of the groups frequently mentioned in criminal justice reporting include organizations such as the Texas Syndicate, Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, and Mexicanimi, among others. Authorities say segregation helps prevent these groups from organizing violence within the general prison population. However, some criminal justice advocates argue that inmates can remain in segregation for extremely long periods, even after their behavior improves. This disagreement has fueled ongoing legal and policy debates about the system. How long can segregation last? One of the most controversial aspects of administrative segregation is its duration. Unlike short-term disciplinary isolation, administrative segregation can last months, years, or even decades. Texas prison officials conduct periodic classification reviews to determine whether inmates should remain in segregation. These reviews examine behavior records, security concerns, and other factors. But critics argue that the process can be slow. Some former inmates interviewed by journalists reported spending many consecutive years in isolation. Prison administrators respond that each case must be evaluated carefully to protect both staff and other inmates. Balancing safety and humane treatment has become one of the most difficult challenges in modern corrections. And it is part of the reason why solitary confinement remains one of the most debated topics in American prison policy. A changing approach. In recent years, Texas has made some changes to how administrative segregation is used. Correctional officials introduced step-down programs designed to allow certain inmates to gradually return to less restrictive housing. These programs often require participants to complete behavioral courses and demonstrate sustained compliance with prison rules. The goal is to reduce long-term isolation when possible. According to reports from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, thousands of inmates have moved out of administrative segregation through these programs over the past decade. Supporters say the approach improves safety by encouraging better behavior and offering a pathway out of isolation. But some advocacy groups argue that more reforms are still needed. They say many prisoners remain in segregation for long periods without clear timelines for release. The debate continues in courtrooms, legislatures, and policy discussions across the state. Death row in Texas. Texas has carried out more executions than any other U.S. state since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Male death row inmates are held at the Polunsky Unit. Executions themselves take place at the Huntsville Unit, where the state's execution chamber is located. Prisoners on death row live under highly controlled conditions. They are housed in single cells and generally remain separated from other inmates. Recreation is conducted alone. Meals are delivered to the cell. Visits with family members occur through secure glass partitions. Legal appeals can last many years, sometimes decades. During that time, inmates may file multiple legal challenges in both state and federal courts. These legal proceedings are one reason death row prisoners often spend long periods awaiting final decisions in their cases. Time and uncertainty. For many inmates, time in prison is measured not just in years, but in uncertainty. Uncertainty about parole. Uncertainty about classification changes. Uncertainty about when, or if, life outside the prison walls will return. Former prisoners interviewed by journalists often describe how the waiting becomes part of daily life. Waiting for a parole decision. Waiting for a transfer. Waiting for a legal appeal. In a system as large as Texas's, these processes can move slowly. And that slow pace is one reason the phrase, Texas time, continues to circulate among inmates. Not because the clock runs differently, but because the experience of waiting can stretch every day into something that feels longer than expected. The human side of the system. Life inside the Texas prison system affects more than just inmates. It also shapes the daily lives of thousands of correctional officers and staff. Working in prisons can be demanding. Officers must maintain security, supervise inmates, and respond quickly to emergencies. Many facilities operate around the clock with rotating shifts. Some prisons are located in rural communities where correctional jobs represent a major source of employment. But the work can also carry risks. Correctional officers sometimes face assaults or confrontations while performing their duties. Balancing safety, order, and fairness is a constant challenge inside any prison system. And in Texas, with one of the largest inmate populations in the country, that challenge is especially significant. The system at a crossroads. Over the past 2 decades, Texas has faced growing pressure to rethink parts of its criminal justice system. Some lawmakers have supported reforms aimed at reducing incarceration rates and expanding rehabilitation programs. Others argue that strict sentencing policies remain necessary to protect public safety. Texas has experimented with several policy changes, including expanded drug courts, diversion programs, and treatment initiatives. Supporters say these programs can reduce repeat offenses and lower prison populations. But critics say the state still relies heavily on incarceration compared with many other countries. The debate over how Texas should balance punishment, rehabilitation, and public safety continues today. Looking ahead, from the prison farms of the 1800s to modern high-security units, the Texas prison system has evolved through decades of legal challenges, political decisions, and social change. But one question remains at the center of the conversation. What should prison time actually mean? Punishment? Deterrence? Rehabilitation? Or some combination of all three? How Texas answers that question will continue to shape the experiences of inmates, staff, and families across the state. And it will determine whether the phrase, Texas time, continues to define the system. Time moves differently behind prison walls. For some, it's measured in days. For others, in decades. The phrase, Texas time, isn't written in law, but for many inmates, it captures the reality of life inside one of the largest prison systems in the world. If you found this story insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden realities of prisons around the world. And if there's a prison system or case you want us to investigate next, let us know in the comments. This is Life Behind Bars, where we uncover the true stories behind prison walls.